at 63 years old. Martha Evans had nothing left but an empty bank account, a pile of medical bills, and a heart broken into pieces after losing her husband of 40 years. She was standing on the freezing, wind-swept banks of the Mississippi River, looking at her entire inheritance, a forgotten, rusted-out river ferry that the entire town called a worthless piece of junk. The local real estate tycoon laughed in her face, telling her she was out of her mind for not selling the land. But 3 weeks later, Martha broke through a false wall beneath the captain's quarters and found a hidden passenger ledger. What was written inside those dust-covered pages didn't contain a list of tourists. It carried a secret that nobody in the town had dared to speak of since 1968, and it was about to change everything. Before we dive into how this hidden ledger completely turned Martha's life around and shook the entire town to its core, I have a quick question for you. Where are you listening to this story right now? And what time is it in your part of the world? Drop a comment down below. I would absolutely love to know. Wherever you are, I wish you a wonderful and blessed day ahead. We pour our hearts into bringing these emotional stories to life. So if you spot any mistakes or have any feedback, please let us know in the comments so we can improve. And if you want to see how Martha fights back and wins, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. It helps our small channel out immensely. Now, let's go back to the very beginning, to the coldest winter Martha had ever faced. The radiator in the kitchen clanked like an old man coughing up rust, a rhythmic, hollow sound that only emphasized the suffocating silence of the house. Martha Evans sat at the scarred oak table, her hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. Outside, the Iowa wind howled across the frozen flats, throwing hard pellets of sleet against the rattling window panes. It was the third week of January, the coldest winter the small town of Oak Haven had seen in 40 years, and Martha was utterly alone. Across the table sat a stack of neat white envelopes, every single one of them stamped with threatening red letters: overdue, final notice, foreclosure proceeding. When Arthur died 3 months ago, he hadn't just left an empty space in her bed. He had left a mountain of medical debt from his 2-year battle with cancer, a debt that was now swallowing her whole. She was 63. Her joints ached with the coming snow, and her bank account held exactly $84. A heavy knock shattered the silence, sharp and demanding. Martha flinched, her heart leaping into her throat. She stood up, smoothing her faded apron, and walked to the front door, the floorboards groaning under her slippers. When she opened it, the icy wind rushed in, bearing the scent of expensive cologne and damp wool. Richard Sterling stood on the porch, a sleek leather briefcase under his arm and a practiced, predatory smile on his face. Richard was the town's wealthiest real estate developer, a man who had spent the last decade buying up the historic riverfront property to build luxury condominiums. "Martha, good morning," Richard said, not waiting for an invitation as he stepped into the small hallway, stamping the snow from his leather boots. "I won't take much of your time. I know things have been incredibly difficult since Arthur passed." Martha braced herself, gripping the edge of the doorway. "What do you want, Richard? If this is about the mortgage, I already told the bank I need more time." Richard offered a soft, sympathetic chuckle that didn't reach his cold blue eyes. "The bank isn't giving you more time, Martha. In fact, they've already sold the debt. To me. I own the note on this house now." The room seemed to tilt slightly. Martha's breath hitched. "You bought my mortgage." "I bought your liabilities," Richard corrected smoothly, tapping his briefcase. "But I'm a reasonable man. I don't want to see a widow out on the street. I'm here to offer you a way out. a complete erasure of all your debts, plus $50,000 in cash. For a split second, a wave of profound relief washed over her, so intense it made her dizzy. No more sleepless nights, no more counting pennies at the grocery store. But then she saw the catch. Richard drew a legal document from his briefcase and laid it on the kitchen table, right beside her cold coffee. "All you have to do," Richard whispered, his voice dripping with false warmth, "is sign over the title to the old riverfront lot, the one with the old ferry boat." Martha stiffened, her relief instantly turning into a cold, sharp dread. "The River Queen. Arthur's father built that ferry. Arthur ran it for 30 years before the new bridge was built. It's all I have left of him." Richard's smile vanished, replaced by a hard, impatient glare. "Martha, look outside. The ferry hasn't moved in 3 decades. It's a rotting husk of iron and timber sitting in a dead slip. It's a public safety hazard, a rusted eyesore that the city wants demolished. You are clinging to a liability that is going to bankrupt you. If you don't sign this over today, the bank will execute the foreclosure on this house by Friday, and you will leave here with absolutely nothing." Martha looked from the legal papers to the window, where the gray waters of the river were visible in the distance. The River Queen was currently anchored at the old, overgrown wooden dock at the edge of town, a place everyone avoided. Why was Richard so desperate for a piece of swampy land and a worthless, ruined boat? It didn't make sense. The lot itself wasn't big enough for his condo project. "I need to think about it," Martha said, her voice trembling but resolute. Richard sneered, stuffing the papers back into his briefcase. "You have until tomorrow morning, Martha. Don't let sentimentality make you a homeless woman." After he slammed the door, Martha didn't cry. Instead, a strange, stubborn anger ignited deep within her chest. She threw on her heaviest winter coat, wrapped a woolen scarf around her neck, and walked out into the biting storm. She walked for 2 miles, her breath forming white clouds in the freezing air, until she reached the desolate northern bend of the river. There, half hidden by overgrown, frozen brambles and weeping willows, lay the wooden dock, and there it was, the River Queen. The 90-foot diesel ferry was a shadow of its former self. The white paint was peeling away like sunburned skin, exposing dark patches of rusted steel underneath. The passenger deck was littered with dead leaves and frozen debris, and the grand wheelhouse at the top looked like a lonely sentinel guarding a forgotten era. It looked exactly like what Richard had called it, a worthless piece of junk. Yet, as Martha stepped onto the shaky wooden pier, a strange sensation crept over her skin. A sharp, distinct smell of old diesel, river mud, and something else. Something like burnt paper drifted through the air. The boat wasn't completely silent. The heavy iron hull groaned against the wooden pilings, a deep, rhythmic thudding that felt almost like a slow heartbeat. She walked up the icy gangplank, her boots crunching on the frost. The cabin door was swollen with moisture, requiring all her strength to push open. Inside, the air was trapped and heavy with the scent of 30 years of neglect. Arthur's old captain's jacket still hung on a peg by the door, covered in dust. Martha's eyes filled with tears as she touched the faded blue wool. She walked toward the master console in the wheelhouse, looking at the dead gauges and the large wooden steering wheel. As she leaned against the console, her foot struck something solid beneath the linoleum floorboards. The sound was hollow, entirely different from the solid metal deck plates elsewhere on the ship. Martha frowned. Kneeling down, she scraped away a layer of dried mud and grime, revealing a small brass ring countersunk into the wood. completely hidden beneath a heavy rubber mat that had rotted away. Her heart began to beat faster. Arthur had never mentioned a hidden compartment. She tugged on the brass ring, but it was rusted shut. Using a rusted screwdriver she found on a nearby shelf, she pried at the edges until the small wooden hatch popped open with a loud crack. Inside the dark, narrow recess lay a heavy metal strongbox, sealed with a thick layer of wax to protect it from the river water. On top of the box, scratched into the iron, were 3 letters: A-V-E. Arthur's father's initials. But before Martha could even touch the box, a loud, metallic scraping sound echoed from the deck below. Someone else was on the boat. Martha froze, holding her breath, as heavy, confident footsteps began to ascend the iron stairs leading straight up to the wheelhouse. The heavy, rhythmic thud of combat boots against the iron steps vibrated right through the wheelhouse floorboards, shaking Martha to her very core. She slammed the small wooden hatch down, frantically kicking the rotting rubber mat back over the brass ring just as a tall, broad-shouldered shadow blocked the frosted glass door. The door flew open with a violent groan of protesting metal, letting in a swirl of icy sleet and a towering man wrapped in a heavy, grease-stained canvas coat. It wasn't Richard Sterling, but it was someone far more dangerous to her peace of mind. Silas Vance, Sterling's chief of demolition and the town's notorious enforcer. Silas stopped in his tracks, his dark eyes narrowing beneath the brim of a dripping wool cap as he spotted Martha kneeling by the console, her fingers still gray with grime. "Well, well, look what the river washed up," Silas barked, his voice sounding like 2 gravel paths grinding together as he stepped into the cramped cabin without an ounce of respect. "Martha Evans, what in God's name are you doing out here in a blizzard? This boat is condemned city property as of noon today." Martha forced herself to stand, using the large wooden steering wheel to steady her trembling knees while keeping her boots firmly planted directly over the hidden compartment. "You're lying, Silas," she said, her voice stronger than she felt, though her heart was drumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Richard Sterling was at my house not even 2 hours ago, trying to buy the title to this lot. The city hasn't condemned a damn thing yet, and you have absolutely no right to be aboard my husband's ship." Silas let out a harsh, mocking laugh that cut through the freezing air, stepping closer until she could smell the stale tobacco and cheap whiskey on his breath. "Your husband is dead, Martha, and his precious little ferry boat is nothing but an illegal barrier blocking a multi-million-dollar harbor expansion. Richard might be playing nice with his fancy legal papers and his $50,000 charity offers, but my crew doesn't play by those rules." He reached into his deep pocket and pulled out a heavy, industrial-sized iron bolt cutter, letting it clank purposefully against the metal casing of the master console right next to her hand. "We're slated to chain this ghost ship to the tugs and drag it out to the deep channel to scuttle it by Friday morning. Signed deed or no signed deed. If I were you, I'd take the money and run before this old tub accidentally catches fire in the middle of the night." The explicit threat hung in the air like poison. But instead of backing down, a sudden blinding flash of clarity pierced through Martha's fear. If the boat was truly just a worthless piece of junk as they claimed, Richard wouldn't be sending his primary enforcer to illegally threaten a widow in a snowstorm, and Silas wouldn't be inspecting the wheelhouse before the demolition crew even arrived. Silas wasn't here to check the structural integrity of the hull. His eyes kept darting around the cabin walls, searching the built-in wooden cabinets and the vintage brass fixtures as if he were looking for something specific that he knew was hidden on board. "Get off my boat, Silas," Martha commanded, her hand wrapping tightly around the rusted screwdriver she had used earlier, her knuckles turning white. If your boots touch this deck again without a formal, court-ordered eviction notice signed by the county sheriff, I will have the state police lock you up for criminal trespassing." Silas stared at her for a long, agonizing moment, his jaw tightening as he weighed his options, before he slowly retrieved his bolt cutters and took a step back toward the door. "You're a stubborn old fool, Martha," he sneered, pointing a thick, scarred finger at her face. "But stubbornness won't pay off those red notices on your kitchen table, and it won't stop the river from swallowing what's ours. You've got less than 24 hours before the real pressure starts." He turned and marched down the iron stairs, his heavy steps fading into the howling wind, followed a minute later by the distant roar of his diesel truck tearing away down the gravel road. The moment the sound died out, Martha collapsed against the wheelhouse wheel, gasping for air as her adrenaline faded into a wave of exhaustion. She knew she didn't have until Friday anymore.
Richard and Silas were going to destroy the ferry immediately, to ensure whatever secret it held was buried forever beneath the muddy waters of the Mississippi. Kneeling back down, she frantically ripped the rubber mat away, hauled open the wooden hatch, and lifted the heavy iron strongbox out of its 30-year-old grave. The wax seal was incredibly tough,
But she used the screwdriver to hack and pry at the edges, spraying dark flakes of beeswax across the floor until the iron latch finally snapped open with a sharp, metallic pop. Inside the box, wrapped carefully in layers of oilcloth to repel the damp river air, lay a thick, leather-bound book with yellowed pages and a heavy brass clasp. The Hidden Passenger Ledger. As Martha unclasped the book and flipped to the first page, expecting to see standard names and dates, her eyes widened in absolute shock at the very first entry written in her father-in-law's precise, elegant cursive. It wasn't a standard log of local commuters or cargo weights. The top of the page read, "The Underground Line, 1965, and right beneath it was a list of names that made her breath catch completely in her throat. The very first name recorded as a secret passenger fleeing the state under the cover of darkness belonged to Jonathan Sterling, Richard Sterling's own father, and next to his name, written in dark red ink, was the terrifying word, fugitive. Before she could even process the historical anomaly, a sudden, violent jolt rocked the entire 90-foot ferry, followed by the terrifying grinding screech of metal tearing against metal from the lower deck. Silas hadn't left after all. He had sabotaged the main mooring cables, and the River Queen was actively breaking free from the dock, drifting helplessly out into the black, icy currents of the raging river. The freezing water of the Mississippi slammed into the rusted hull with a sound like a thunderclap, forcing Martha off her feet as the entire 90-foot ferry groaned and pitched violently to the port side. The leather-bound ledger slipped from her numb fingers, sliding across the dusty linoleum floor toward the shattered doorframe where the icy sleet was now howling directly into the wheelhouse. Panic tore through her chest as she watched the precious book dangerously approach the edge. But she scrambled on her hands and knees, ignoring the sharp pain in her joints, and pinned it down with her elbow just as another massive wave rocked the vessel. Below her, the grinding screech of the severed steel mooring cables dragging against the rocks confirmed her worst nightmare. Silas Vance hadn't just threatened her. He had actively cast her adrift in the middle of a historic winter storm, leaving a 63-year-old widow to drown in the freezing currents. Martha clutched the ledger to her chest like a shield, desperately pulling herself up using the massive wooden steering wheel, her eyes wide with terror as she looked through the frosted windows. The familiar, frozen shoreline of Oak Haven was rapidly receding into the gray, swirling mist, replaced by the chaotic black expanse of the main river channel, where chunks of jagged ice were swirling like broken glass. She knew absolutely nothing about operating a 90-foot diesel ferry. The complex array of dead brass gauges, heavy iron levers, and modern electronic switches on the master console looked like a foreign language to her. She slammed her palm against the main starter button, praying for a miracle. But the massive engine below remained dead, emitting only a hollow, metallic click that echoed mockingly through the empty cabins. Suddenly, a bright, blinding flash of light cut through the blinding sleet from the dark shoreline behind her, catching her attention. Martha squinted through the storm and spotted the distinct silhouette of Silas Vance's heavy diesel truck parked at the edge of the abandoned quarry overlook, its high beams flashing in a slow, triumphant rhythm as he watched the ghost ship drift toward the deadly rapids of Devil's Elbow downriver. He wasn't trying to hide his crime. He was celebrating it, knowing that when the river claimed the River Queen, the dark secrets of the Sterling family legacy would be buried forever beneath tons of mud and ice. The sheer injustice of it sparkled a fierce, blinding rage through Martha's veins, burning away her paralyzing fear and replacing it with a stubborn will to survive. She refused to let Richard Sterling and his thuggish enforcer win, and she refused to let Arthur's memory be erased by a manufactured accident. She remembered Arthur once telling her that the old ferry had an emergency manual backup system for the rudder located in the lower aft compartment, a mechanical override designed to steer the ship even if the main hydraulic lines were completely severed or dead. Clutching the heavy leather ledger tightly under her arm, she forced open the heavy wheelhouse door against the roaring wind and began her treacherous descent down the icy iron stairs, her boots slipping on the frozen sleet with every single step. The lower deck was a terrifying labyrinth of shadows and groaning metal, the river water already splashing through the scuppers and coating the iron floor plates in a slick, treacherous sheen of ice. As she reached the narrow hatch leading down into the dark aft compartment, a sudden, heavy crash from the bow made the entire ship shudder violently. Martha froze, her breath catching in her throat as she heard the unmistakable sound of a heavy fiberglass hull scraping against the ferry's rusted iron flank, followed by the deep, low thrum of a high-powered marine engine. Someone was boarding the drifting vessel in the middle of the storm. She pressed herself against a rusted steel bulkhead, holding her breath as a dark figure clad in a bright orange flotation jacket and a black neoprene mask vaulted over the side rail. A heavy industrial crowbar gripped tightly in his gloved hand. It was one of Silas's demolition lackeys, sent to ensure the ship sank completely, or perhaps to retrieve the very strong box she had just uncovered before the vessel went under. The intruder didn't see her in the darkness. He immediately marched toward the central companionway leading up to the wheelhouse, his crowbar trailing against the iron wall with a terrifying, rhythmic clinking sound. Realizing she had only seconds before he discovered the empty hidden compartment and realized she had the ledger, Martha quietly slipped through the aft hatch, dropping down into the cramped, pitch-black belly of the ship, where the smell of ancient oil and river water was suffocating. She found the massive emergency steering tiller, a giant iron bar connected directly to the rudder shaft, covered in thick, hardened grease. Using every single ounce of her remaining strength, she threw her entire body weight against the freezing iron bar, screaming in agony as her muscles strained against the immense pressure of the raging river current. Slowly, agonizingly, the iron bar began to move, and she felt the massive ferry violently lean as the rudder caught the water, turning the ship away from the deadly rocks of Devil's Elbow and toward the dark, shallow marshes of the eastern bank. But the sudden change in course caught the intruder above completely off guard. A loud curse echoed through the deck plates, followed by the heavy sound of his body crashing into a steel locker. Martha held her breath as she heard the heavy, furious footsteps turn around and sprint directly toward the aft hatch, the beam of a powerful flashlight cutting through the darkness above her head, as the hunter realized his prey was trapped right beneath his feet. The beam of the powerful LED flashlight sliced through the darkness of the aft hatch like a scalpel, illuminating the dust motes and the thick grease on the emergency tiller just inches from Martha's face. She squeezed herself into the narrow, oily gap between the heavy rudder casing and the freezing steel hull, pressing the leather ledger flat against her ribs and holding her breath until her lungs burned. Above her, the heavy thud of insulated boots rattled the iron grating of the deck plates, each step vibrating through her teeth as the intruder stepped closer to the ladder. "I know you're down here, old woman," a muffled voice snarled from behind the neoprene mask, the tone dripping with cold impatience. Silas saw the rudder move from the overlook. "You think you're clever, but you're just making this a whole lot harder on yourself than it needs to be." The man began his slow descent down the narrow iron rungs, his crowbar clinking against the metal frame with a terrifying, deliberate rhythm. Martha's eyes frantically searched the pitch-black alcove for anything she could use as a weapon, her fingers brushing against a heavy discarded iron spanner wrench half buried in a pool of congealed engine oil. She wrapped her cold, stiffened fingers around the frozen metal handle, bracing her feet against the hull as the intruder's boots finally touched the lower deck plates just 3 feet away from her hiding spot. The flashlight beam swung wildly across the dark compartment, illuminating the massive diesel tanks and the maze of rusted pipes before sweeping toward the narrow gap where she crouched. Just as the bright light hit her face, blinding her completely, Martha screamed with every ounce of fury she possessed and swung the heavy iron spanner with a desperate, two-handed arc straight toward the source of the light. The heavy wrench struck the intruder's forearm with a sickening, metallic crunch, shattering the glass lens of the flashlight and sending it clattering into the oily bilge water where it hissed and died, plunging the compartment into absolute darkness once again. The man let out a sharp howl of agony, dropping his crowbar with a loud clatter as he stumbled backward into the massive steering assembly, his heavy coat catching on the gears. Martha didn't wait to see if he would recover. She scrambled out of the narrow gap on her hands and knees, clawing her way up the iron rungs of the ladder with an adrenaline-fueled strength she didn't know she possessed. She burst through the upper hatch into the howling storm, slamming the heavy iron cover down and throwing the heavy brass locking bar into place just as the furious intruder began throwing his weight against the metal from below, his muffled curses echoing through the deck plates. The storm had reached a terrifying crescendo, the blinding sleet turning into a wall of white that completely obscured both shorelines. But the ferry's sudden turn had driven the bow straight into a dense, swampy thicket of frozen weeping willows and thick river reeds near the eastern bank. With a tremendous, bone-jarring crash that tore the iron railing from the port side, the River Queen ground to a sudden, violent halt, wedging its massive hull deep into the frozen mud and sandbanks. The violent impact threw Martha across the deck, her shoulder slamming hard against the steel bulkhead. But she refused to let go of the precious leather ledger. Gasping for breath, her body aching from the bruises, she dragged herself up and realized that the intruder was still trapped in the lower hold. But his accomplices on the high-powered marine boat would undoubtedly hear the crash and come to finish the job. She had to get off the ship immediately. She rushed to the battered starboard side, looking down at the dark, swirling waters separating the ferry from the muddy, snow-covered bank. The distance was barely 4 feet, but the current below was still a treacherous trap of swirling ice chunks. Clutching the ledger inside her heavy winter coat to keep it dry, Martha climbed over the ruined side rail, took a deep, terrifying breath and leaped straight into the freezing darkness toward the shore. Her boots hit the slippery, mud-slicked bank with a heavy thud, sending her tumbling into a thick drift of snow that cushioned her fall, but instantly soaked through her clothing with bone-chilling water. She scrambled to her feet, her teeth chattering uncontrollably as she looked back at the silhouette of the stranded ferry, noticing a second set of headlights fast approaching along the deserted dirt road that wound through the marshes. It was Richard Sterling's sleek luxury SUV, trailing closely behind Silas Vance's heavy diesel truck, their bright high beams cutting through the swirling sleet as they raced toward the crash site. Martha turned away from the river, her legs shaking with exhaustion as she plunged into the dense, frozen woods, desperate to find shelter before the men discovered she had escaped the boat with the single piece of evidence that could destroy their entire empire. As she stumbled through the blinding snow, her fingers numbly feeling the thick brass clasp of the ledger beneath her coat, she accidentally tripped over a hidden tree root, falling hard against a small, half-buried stone marker that sat at the edge of an old, forgotten clearing. Shaking the snow from her eyes, she pulled out a small pocket lighter Arthur had given her. Flicking the flame to life for a brief second to see where she had fallen, the small flame illuminated the weathered, hand-carved letters on the stone marker, and Martha's breath caught in her throat as she realized she hadn't just stumbled into a random forest. She was standing in the middle of a hidden, historic cemetery. And the name engraved on the stone beneath her hands was Elijah Vance, 1961, the grandfather of the very man trying to hunt her down. Before she could investigate further, the loud, unmistakable crack of a dry branch breaking echoed from the trees just 20 yards behind her, followed by the low, menacing growl of a tracking dog cutting through the whistling wind. Me. The terrifying growl of the tracking dog ripped through the freezing air, sending a fresh jolt of pure adrenaline straight into Martha's aching limbs. She scrambled to her feet, pressing her hand hard over her mouth to muffle her ragged breathing as she plunged deeper into the dark, labyrinthine woods of the forgotten clearing. Behind her, the powerful beams of heavy industrial flashlights danced frantically across the snow-laden canopy, casting long, monstrous shadows that seemed to twist and reach for her through the blinding sleet. "Find her!" Silas Vance's harsh, gravelly voice echoed through the trees, laced with a desperate fury that proved he knew exactly what she had taken from the ferry's hidden compartment. "She's a 63-year-old woman in a blizzard. Damn it! She couldn't have gone more than a few hundred yards from the bank." Martha stumbled blindly over the uneven ground, her soaked winter coat dragging her down like lead, until she spotted the crumbling stone facade of an old, abandoned mausoleum, half buried under a massive fallen oak tree at the far edge of the historic cemetery. She threw herself through the narrow, iron-gated doorway, squeezing her body into a pitch-black alcove behind a cracked marble sarcophagus just as the heavy thud of combat boots crunched into the clearing outside. Through the rusted bars of the gate, she watched Silas Vance and two of his demolition crew break into the open space, their massive flashlights sweeping directly over the weathered stone marker of Elijah Vance she had discovered moments before. The tracking dog, a massive German shepherd, strained aggressively against its leather leash, its nose glued to the exact spot where Martha had fallen in the snow. "Silas, over here!" one of the men shouted, pointing his flashlight at the ground. "Fresh tracks leading toward the old Vance family tomb. But the dog is going crazy right here at your grandfather's grave." Silas stepped forward, his face twisting into a mask of pure hatred as he stared down at the weathered headstone, before he unexpectedly kicked the stone with his heavy boot, shattering a corner of the ancient, hand-carved marble. "Forget the grave, you idiot. Find the woman." Silas growled, though his voice trembled with a strange, deep-seated fear that Martha had never heard from him before. If Richard finds out she got into that wheelhouse hatch before we scuttled the ship, he'll ruin both of us. That ledger contains things that can put my entire family in prison for what happened to the town's union workers back in '61. The revelation hit Martha like a physical blow in the darkness of the tomb. Her fingers tightening around the brass clasp of the leather book tucked securely against her ribs. This wasn't just about Richard Sterling's father being a fugitive. It was about a generational crime that linked the Vance family and the Sterling family in a conspiracy of violence that had shaped the entire history of Oakhaven. Suddenly, the German shepherd let out a sharp, piercing bark and lunged directly toward the iron gate of the mausoleum, its powerful jaws snapping violently against the rusted iron bars just inches from where Martha was crouching. Silas turned his flashlight toward the entrance, the blinding beam cutting through the darkness and illuminating the edge of Martha's wet woolen scarf sticking out from behind the marble sarcophagus. Well, well, looks like the old bird decided to hide in my family's own backyard, Silas whispered, a slow, sadistic smile spreading across his face as he reached into his heavy canvas coat and pulled out a sleek, black industrial wire cutter to snip the rusted chain locking the mausoleum gate. Martha knew she was trapped with absolutely nowhere left to run, her heart hammering so violently against her ribs that she could barely breathe as the heavy iron chain snapped with a loud, echoey metallic crack. But just as Silas threw the heavy iron gate open, his boot stepping into the dark tomb, a sudden, blinding white light flared up from the woods behind them, followed by the deafening, authoritative wail of a police siren that shattered the winter silence. "State Police! Drop your weapons and step away from the structure immediately!" A booming voice commanded through a megaphone, causing Silas and his men to freeze in absolute shock as three distinct figures in law enforcement uniforms burst into the clearing with their service weapons drawn. In the confusion, Martha didn't look at the police. Her eyes locked onto a fourth figure standing right behind the troopers, an elderly, silver-haired man wrapped in a fine wool coat holding an old, tarnished brass lantern that looked exactly like the one Arthur's father used to carry. It was Thomas Miller, the retired chief engineer of the River Queen and Arthur's oldest living friend, whom she hadn't seen in over 15 years. As Silas slowly raised his hands in surrender, his eyes burning with the murderous promises, Thomas stepped into the mausoleum, his eyes meeting Martha's terrified gaze in the darkness. "I saw the ferry drifting from the upper bridge, Martha," Thomas whispered softly, his voice cracking with emotion as he reached out a trembling hand to help her up. "I knew what they were trying to do, and I knew what Arthur hid down there all those years ago. It's time to open that book, because the people they hurt are finally ready to speak." The heavy iron door of Thomas Miller's remote riverside cabin shut out the howling Iowa blizzard, the thick oak timbers muffling the distant, fading wails of the state police cruisers escorting Silas Vance away in handcuffs. Martha collapsed into a faded plaid armchair by the roaring hearth, her entire body shaking uncontrollably as Thomas wrapped a thick wool blanket around her damp shoulders and handed her a steaming mug of black tea. Her hands trembled so violently that the ceramic rattled against her teeth. But her eyes never left the leather-bound passenger ledger, resting flat on the heavy pine coffee table between them. Thomas sat opposite her, his weathered face etched with deep lines of sorrow, as he picked up a pair of reading glasses and stared at the gold-embossed brass clasp of the ancient book. "Silas won't be out on bail tonight, Martha. But Richard Sterling has judges and politicians in his pocket. Those state troopers can only hold his men for trespassing and reckless endangerment until Richard's lawyers show up at dawn," Thomas murmured. his voice heavy with caution as he gently unclasped the book, the dry parchment crackling like autumn leaves in the quiet room. Martha leaned forward, her voice a sharp, raspy whisper. "Thomas, look at the first entry. It says Jonathan Sterling was a fugitive in 1965, and Arthur's father was hiding him on the River Queen. Why would Richard try to sink the ferry to hide something that makes his own father look like a victim?" Thomas let out a long, hollow sigh, slowly turning the yellowed pages until he reached a section dated June 1961, where the elegant cursive handwriting completely stopped, replaced by a jagged, frantic script written in dark red ink. Jonathan Sterling wasn't a victim. Martha, he was a thief. And the Vance family was his muscle, Thomas explained, pointing a trembling finger at a column of figures listed next to the names of nearly 50 local shipyard and foundry workers. In '61, Oak Haven was a booming union town, and the workers had pooled all their life savings into a private pension fund managed by the town bank, which Jonathan owned. He embezzled every single dollar, nearly $3 million back then, to fund his first major real estate empire down in Chicago. Martha felt the air leave her lungs as the puzzle pieces began to violently slam together in her mind. And the Vance family. Elijah Vance, Silas's grandfather, was the union boss who was supposed to protect the workers, Thomas whispered, his eyes dark with memory. Jonathan bribed him with a 20% stake in the new development company to falsify the union records, making it look like the pension fund collapsed due to bad investments. When a group of 12 honest workers discovered the fraud and threatened to go to the federal authorities, Jonathan and Elijah used the cover of a massive river barge accident to silence them forever. They trapped those men in a flooded dry dock, and Arthur's father was forced at gunpoint to use the River Queen to ferry the stolen cash out of the state before the investigators arrived. Martha gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she stared at the faded red ink. But Arthur's father didn't destroy the evidence. He recorded it. Exactly, Thomas said, his voice tightening with a sudden surge of pride. Captain Evans couldn't stop the murder of his friends, but he spent the next 30 years secretly using the ferry to transport the surviving widows and children out of this corrupt county, tracking every dollar of the stolen money that Richard Sterling's family used to build Oak Haven's luxury waterfront. This ledger isn't just a list of names. It's a detailed financial map proving that every single piece of property Richard Sterling owns today was bought with blood money belonging to the descendants of those 12 murdered union workers. Suddenly, a sharp metallic ping echoed from Thomas's kitchen counter, followed by the frantic, high-pitched chirping of a police scanner he kept on the shelf. A frantic voice broke through the static. "All units, we have an emergency situation at the county courthouse. A black SUV has forced its way into the secure parking garage, and suspect Silas Vance has been forcibly released from custody by private security elements. Repeat, Vance is at large, and a secondary suspect, Richard Sterling, is currently moving toward the Northern River Road." Martha stood up so fast her chair screeched against the hardwood floor, her heart hammering against her ribs as she looked out the window. Through the blinding wall of snow, a pair of powerful twin high beams appeared at the edge of Thomas's long dirt driveway, the massive black luxury SUV tearing through the snowdrifts at an impossible speed, heading straight for the isolated cabin. Richard Sterling wasn't waiting for the morning lawyers anymore. He had broken his enforcer out of jail, and they were coming to execute the final witness and burn the ledger to ashes before the truth could ever leave the riverbank. If the roar of the luxury SUV's engine outside shattered the glass in Thomas's small kitchen window, sending a shower of sharp crystals raining down onto the linoleum floor. Martha didn't think. She snatched the heavy leather passenger ledger from the pine table and shoved it deep into the front pocket of her thick wool blanket wrapper, her heart slamming against her ribs like a trapped bird. Thomas lunged across the room, his old bones groaning as he threw the heavy brass deadbolt into place just a second before a massive blow struck the oak door from the outside, making the entire cabin shudder. "Open the damn door, Miller!" Silas Vance's voice bellowed through the wood, sounding crazed and desperate, stripped of all the arrogance he had possessed on the boat. "We know the widow is in there, and we know what you're holding. Richard is outside, and he's done playing games with the law." Through the shattered kitchen window, the blinding headlights of the idling SUV cast long, distorted shadows across the living room walls, illuminating Richard Sterling's sleek figure leaning against the hood, a heavy crowbar gripped casually in his leather-gloved hand. Thomas grabbed Martha's arm, his grip surprisingly ironclad for a man his age, and pulled her toward a narrow pantry at the back of the cabin where a dusty trapdoor was built into the floorboards. "This leads to the old root cellar. Martha, there's a drainage tunnel that empties out right into the limestone bluffs above the river," Thomas whispered urgently, his breath hot and ragged against her ear as the sound of a heavy splintering crack echoed from the front door. "Take the ledger and go. I'm 82 years old and I'm not running from these bastards anymore." Martha shook her head violently, her tears freezing on her cheeks. "I am not leaving you here alone. Thomas, they'll kill you for what you know." Thomas gave her a tragic, determined smile, gently pushing her down into the dark opening of the trapdoor, just as the main oak door finally gave way with a deafening crash of splintering wood and tearing hinges. "They can't kill a ghost. Martha, tell the town what happened to the 12. Thomas cried out, slamming the heavy trapdoor shut above her head and dragging a massive oak cabinet over the opening just as Silas's heavy combat boots stormed into the cabin above. Martha crouched in the absolute pitch-black dampness of the root cellar, her fingers desperately tracing the cold brass clasp of the ledger against her ribs as she listened to the violent struggle unfolding directly over her head. She heard the sound of furniture breaking, followed by Silas's furious demands, and then a cold, cultured voice that could only belong to Richard Sterling himself. "Where is the book, Thomas?" My father spent 40 years trying to find where Captain Evans hid that documentation, and I am not going to let a pathetic old engineer and a penniless widow ruin my corporation's entire future, Richard smoothed, followed by a sickening thud and a low groan from Thomas that made Martha's blood run completely cold. She wanted to scream, to climb back up and fight them with her bare hands, but she knew that if they got their hands on the ledger, Thomas's sacrifice and Arthur's entire family legacy would be erased from existence forever. Crawling on her knees through the narrow, mud-slicked drainage tunnel, the smell of rotting leaves and wet limestone suffocating her, she guided herself by the faint, distant sound of the rushing river until she burst out onto a narrow, snow-covered ledge halfway up the limestone bluffs. The storm was still raging, but as she looked down at the dark valley below, her eyes widened in absolute shock as she spotted a series of flickering lights moving along the old quarry path on the opposite bank. It wasn't the police. It was a small convoy of older pickup trucks and rugged farm vehicles driving in total silence without their headlights on, their hazard lights blinking in a secret, rhythmic pattern that Arthur had once shown her. As she peered closer, she recognized the rusted blue Chevy belonging to Clara Higgins, the 84-year-old widow of one of the 12 murdered union workers from 1961, and behind her were dozens of other descendants, holding old lanterns and hunting rifles, moving like a silent army toward Thomas's cabin. The town hadn't forgotten the blood money that built Sterling's empire. They had been waiting for 3 generations for someone to find the proof. And the hidden passenger ledger in Martha's pocket was the final spark that was about to ignite a revolution along the Mississippi. The freezing wind whipped around Martha as she slid down the slick limestone embankment, her fingers clinging desperately to the leather ledger hidden inside her coat. Behind her, Thomas's cabin was a dark silhouette against the snow. But the headlights of Richard Sterling's luxury SUV suddenly pivoted, their blinding beams cutting through the trees and illuminating her frantic descent.
"There she is!"
Silas Vance shouted from the porch, his heavy boots crunching into the snow as he gave chase, his face twisted in a desperate fury. Martha's heart hammered against her ribs as she plunged into the thick undergrowth toward the dirt quarry path, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Just as she stumbled onto the gravel road, the roar of Clara Higgins' rusted blue Chevy truck cut through the howling storm, skidding to a halt right in front of her. The passenger door flew open, and Clara, her weathered face set in grim determination, reached out an arm surprisingly strong for an 84-year-old widow. "Get in, Martha. Get in now," Clara yelled over the engine's rumble, her eyes catching the distinct brass clasp of the ledger peeking out from Martha's jacket. Martha threw herself into the cab, slamming the door just as Silas lunged at the trunk, his fist striking the glass before the vehicle roared away, fishtailing on the ice. In the rearview mirror, Martha watched Richard Sterling's black SUV instantly pull out of Thomas's driveway to pursue them, its massive frame closing the distance with terrifying speed. "They killed them, Clara," Martha choked out, her voice trembling as she clutched the ledger to her chest like a shield. "Arthur's father recorded everything. Your husband, the 12 workers, the stolen union pension. It was all Jonathan Sterling and Elijah Vance." Clara's knuckles turned white on the steering wheel, a single tear escaping her eye and carving a path through the dust on her cheek. "We always knew it in our bones, Martha. But we lacked the paper trail. For 60 years, they controlled the police, the banks, and the town council, burying our men and our dignity under their luxury riverfront developments." Suddenly, a violent jolt shook the truck from behind. Richard had intentionally rammed their bumper, the impact sending the Chevy skidding toward the steep, unfenced edge of the river bluff. The headlights of the SUV blinded Martha through the rear window, and she could see Richard's cold, unblinking glare behind the windshield as he prepared to ram them a second time, clearly intending to push the old truck into the black, icy depths of the Mississippi below. Clara gritted her teeth, throwing her weight into the steering wheel to stabilize the truck as they approached the narrow bottleneck of the old Oak Haven Bridge. "Hold on!" Clara screamed as she slammed on the brakes unexpectedly, causing Richard's massive SUV to rear-end them with full force. But the sudden friction slowed both vehicles just enough for a dozen other headlights to materialize from the blinding snow at the opposite end of the bridge. The descendants of the 12 workers had arrived, blocking the entire exit with heavy farm tractors, rusted flatbeds, and hunting rifles raised in unity. Richard Sterling was forced to slam on his brakes, his luxury vehicle skidding to a halt mere inches from Clara's truck, completely boxed in from all sides by the silent, furious townspeople he had exploited for decades. Silas Vance burst from the passenger side of the SUV, brandishing a heavy crowbar and screaming threats. But he froze when the unmistakable click of a dozen shotguns echoing across the frozen bridge shattered the winter silence. Clara stepped out of the truck, her small frame standing tall against the wind, and looked directly at Richard Sterling through his tinted windshield. "It's over, Richard," Clara shouted, her voice carrying a generational weight that silenced the storm. "The River Queen didn't sink. The ledger is in our hands, and the shadows your father built this town upon are finally stepping into the light."
"You
The blinding glare of a dozen high beams reflected off the snow-slicked hood of Richard Sterling's luxury SUV, pinning him and Silas Vance like rats caught in a spotlight on the narrow Oakhaven Bridge. Richard slammed his palms against the leather steering wheel, his face twisting into a mask of pure desperation as he realized his private security elements were completely outnumbered by the silent, armed wall of townspeople blocking the exit. Silas Vance stepped out into the freezing wind, his heavy boots crunching on the packed ice as he raised a loaded industrial nail gun he had grabbed from the back seat. His voice cracked with manic energy.
"Get the hell out of our way," Silas bellowed, his breath forming thick white clouds in the storm. "You people are interfering with a corporate repossession. That old woman stole company documents from a condemned vessel, and you're all going to prison as accomplices." Clara Higgins didn't even flinch. She stood firmly at the front of the blockade, her hand resting on the weathered wooden stock of her late husband's hunting rifle. Flanked by young and old descendants who had grown up in the bitter shadow of the Sterling family's stolen wealth, Martha opened the passenger door of Clara's truck, stepping out onto the icy bridge with the leather-bound ledger held high above her head, the gold-embossed brass clasp catching the sharp glare of the headlights. "The only thieves on this river are named Sterling and Vance." Martha's voice rang out across the frozen expanse, carried by the howling wind into the ears of every single townsperson assembled. Arthur's father recorded everything in '61. The exact account numbers, the signatures, the bribe paid to Elijah Vance, and the names of the 12 workers who were deliberately locked in that dry dock to drown for trying to expose the truth. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by the dark, heavy rumble of shotgun slides clicking into place simultaneously across the bridge line. Richard Sterling slowly stepped out of his SUV, his expensive wool coat instantly dusted with sleet, his hands raised in a calculating gesture of surrender as he tried to regain control of the room with his practiced corporate charm. "Martha, let's be reasonable," Richard smoothed, taking a slow, deliberate step toward her, though his cold blue eyes were frantically scanning for an escape route. "That ledger is 60 years old. It's ancient history, and it holds no legal weight in a modern court of law. I am prepared to offer you, Clara, and every family represented here, a massive financial settlement. $2 million right now, no questions asked. If you hand over that book and let us dismantle the ferry in peace." Suddenly, the authoritative, booming wail of Federal Bureau of Investigation sirens echoed from the dark highway behind the blockade, followed by 4 sleek black tactical vans roaring onto the bridge, their blue and red emergency lights painting the snow in a chaotic rhythm. Thomas Miller stepped out from the lead federal vehicle, his head bandaged from his earlier encounter with Silas, but his eyes blazing with absolute triumph as he pointed a finger directly at Richard. "The statute of limitations never runs out on murder or grand federal embezzlement. Richard?" Thomas shouted over the sirens, flanked by a dozen heavily armed federal agents who instantly surrounded the SUV. "I sent a digital scan of the first 10 pages from my cabin before you broke my door down. The Department of Justice has already frozen every single asset belonging to Sterling Development Corporation." Silas Vance panicked, spinning around to aim his weapon at Martha in a last-ditch effort to destroy the evidence. But 2 federal agents tackled him hard into the ice before he could pull the trigger, stripping him of his weapon and slapping heavy steel cuffs on his wrists. Richard Sterling fell to his knees in the cold snow as an agent read him his rights, his billion-dollar empire crumbling into absolute nothingness against the backdrop of the very river his father had polluted with blood money. Martha wrapped her arms around Clara as the townspeople erupted into tears and cheers of generational relief. Knowing that the 90-foot ghost ship wedged in the mud downriver
had finally delivered its final, devastating payload. 6 months later, the early summer sun danced across the sparkling, crystal blue waters of the Mississippi River, painting the newly restored white hull of the River Queen in brilliant shades of gold. Martha Evans stood proudly on the grand upper deck, her hands resting on the polished mahogany railing as a gentle, warm breeze ruffled her hair, a sharp contrast to the suffocating grief that had threatened to destroy her life just half a year ago. The 90-foot ferry was no longer a rotting husk of iron and timber trapped in a dead slip. It had been completely transformed into Oak Haven's official historical museum and maritime education center, funded entirely by the restitution assets seized from the corrupt Sterling Development Corporation. Down on the bustling wooden pier, hundreds of local townspeople had gathered for the grand reopening ceremony, their faces illuminated with deep joy and a profound sense of generational relief. Clara Higgins sat in the front row of the pavilion, her weathered face wreathed in smiles as she watched her grandchildren play near a newly erected bronze monument dedicated to the 12 union workers who had finally received justice. The hidden passenger ledger, now securely preserved inside a climate-controlled glass display case inside the captain's quarters, had served as the federal crown jewel that dismantled Richard Sterling's entire financial empire, forcing a historic court ruling that returned every single acre of stolen riverfront land back to the descendants of the exploited families. Suddenly, Thomas Miller stepped out from the wheelhouse behind Martha, wearing a crisp new captain's hat and holding a shiny brass clipboard. His eyes crinkled with absolute triumph as he tapped the master console. She's fully pressurized and ready for her maiden voyage. Martha, every single gauge is in the green, and the engine sounds smoother than it did back in 1972, Thomas said, his voice trembling slightly with emotion as he gestured toward the horizon. Martha smiled warmly, but as her fingers brushed against the pocket of her linen trousers, her hand encountered a small, unfamiliar rectangular object wrapped in crisp parchment paper that someone must have slipped into her jacket during the crowded ribbon-cutting downstairs. Her heart skipped a beat as she pulled it out, carefully unfolding the paper to reveal a vintage, gold-plated master skeleton key stamped with the unique initials J.S. Jonathan Sterling's personal mark alongside a hurried, anonymous, handwritten note that read, "The courthouse vault wasn't the only place Richard hid the original asset deeds. Check the double-bottom hull beneath the ballast tanks before the corporation's final liquidation on Friday." The sudden revelation sent a sharp, thrilling shockwave through Martha's veins, signaling that the mystery of the River Queen was far from over, and that a completely new layer of buried history was waiting to be uncovered right beneath their feet. She caught Thomas's eye, a knowing, determined look passing between the two old friends as she walked over to the main control panel, her grip tightening on the heavy iron lever of the ship's horn. With a profound sense of closure and an unyielding readiness for whatever secrets lay ahead, Martha pulled the lever, letting out a deep, majestic, and thunderous roar from the ferry's horn that echoed triumphantly across the vast river, announcing to the entire world that the Evans family legacy was finally and eternally reborn.